All right, so I'm Fluin. I think most of you know me. I am actually now a developer advocate at Trello, which is a really cool company. So my role there is in focusing on how do people build integrations and how do we at Trello support those integrations through making our API better, making our documentation better. So if you guys are fans of Trello, which I know a lot of people are, think about integrating with it. It's kind of cool. I'm also they changed the name of the program. So it used to be Google Developer Expert, but now it's Google Expert in web technologies. So hopefully we're getting a new logo and things like that with the program. Basically Google has said, hey, you know something about those web-y technologies, and you should talk about it more. New logo. What does everyone think? Who likes the new logo? Okay, who hates the new logo? All right. Why do you guys hate it?
It's so blocky. Like that's a pretty scripted for it, not just like. It looks like an Arial font.
I saw this logo and I thought like it was like a kid's toy company.
Yeah.
Like Play-Doh or Fun Time. We're stuck with it, right? Google keeps doing these sweeping announcements. It's a little weird. So Alphabet, right? Like Google is not Google anymore. Like which fanboy am I now? Am I an Alphabet fanboy or a Google fanboy? So
I won't complain if the stock goes up.
What was that?
I won't complain if the stock goes up.
Yeah. Although you don't have a voting share, so.
Yeah.
That's exciting news, but I'm here to talk for a little bit about service workers. So as Lloyd said, we're going to have two talks tonight. Mine's going to be the shorter, easier one, just to kind of spice and explain what service workers are and get you guys a little bit interested. 3 parts. I'll introduce kind of what is a service worker, where does it come from, where's it going. I'll talk through some of the concepts and techniques for building things using service workers. And then lastly, putting service workers to work, I'll go into some of the details of an implementation and point you guys in a couple directions to look at it. So who here has built something with service workers today? Okay, how about, and that's good, because that's the level I'm going for here. And what about, has anyone used Android push notifications, or Chrome push notifications? How many people have used Slack before? Slack, the communication network. Okay, a bunch of you. So one of the features of Slack now, it's a web application. They have a bunch of desktop native applications. But one of the things you can do is, without installing anything, using your browser, you can subscribe to push notifications. So whenever you get a new chat message, it's going to pop up on your browser even when you don't have the web page open, which is kind of the magic of service worker. So I'm going to go into the kind of the history here. So I think everyone here has probably seen this. This is old Windows in the world that when we had apps. So I tend to think of this as the world before 2004, right? So every program that you wanted to use was downloaded to your computer, or insert a floppy disk or CD-ROM. You install it, so it puts something on your computer, and then when you want to uninstall it, you try and remove it, and it doesn't work. But that's the world we lived in. And then around 2004, it was the rise of web applications. It was this idea of a transactional site that I go to. I don't need to install anything. I just need a username and password. It identifies who I am, and then it serves me the right content in response to these various URL parameters that I'm sending to them. And that was kind of a very magic world, right? Because we eventually had this idea that I can build a website and it's going to run on all these devices. And that's kind of the world we live in today, right? So there's still the idea of native mobile applications, which I'll talk about in a second. But you can build a single website today if you're doing a startup, and it will work on pretty much every device that can connect to the internet. But what ends up happening is when you look at native applications, there's a lot of benefits to native applications, right? So they're better performing, they have better access to sensors, they have better access to hardware. So since 2004, things have kind of shifted, right? 2008, the iPhone came out, and native applications often became a better choice than web apps, right? And unfortunately for any company of any significant size, that ends up meaning that you need both a website, a responsive website that works on mobile and desktop, and a native application, which I would say is still the world that we're living in today, but things are starting to change. And so kind of that glory, that dream that we had of the web back in 2004 of, hey, I'm going to build an application that's going to live separately from the client, and then it's going to work on all the devices. It doesn't really matter what browser they're using, etc. That's kind of coming true because the HTML5 standards group is solidifying all these things that give us capabilities that we had in native applications but never had in websites. So service workers, there's a few concepts that I want to talk through here. At the highest level, service workers are a thread of your web application, right? So you can, right now, a lot of websites, almost every website that I use, has some sort of JavaScript application running client side, right? So whether it's I'm going to animate something going across the screen, whether I'm going to swap out states of the application, every good web application, and good means responsive, performant, low latency, they're doing some sort of client-side operation. And Service Worker is a way of giving that client-side application more capabilities and more superpowers here. So things you can do is, does anyone remember index, I think it's called index caching, or cache.manifest files? So there was a failed attempt to provide all of these offline capabilities to web applications about 2 years ago. And what ended up happening was you'd ship a manifest file, and then the browser would download all of those files, and then it would load those instead of the website some of the time. The problem was you really couldn't tell or control what was loading where, which caused a really confusing mess, right? When we think about native mobile applications like Android apps, you have a very clear concept of what's going to run, right? There is an app on the phone, and it will always run that app, and then some of the time it's going to go out and check the Play Store for updates, and it's going to download and install those updates, and it's going to replace the application. And so if anyone's ever been in an Android app, while it's downloading and updating, it actually just kicks you out of the app and then it relaunches, right? It's a low barrier, but there is that context switch that actually swaps out the app. Service Workers moves that into provides those same sort of capabilities as Cache manifested, but it provides it in pure JavaScript. I say no user required, which means that traditionally web pages are for things that you're looking at on the screen, right? You're in Chrome, you're in Firefox, you're in some other browser that you compiled from source. And that browser is interacting with the user every time they do something, and if they close that, you lose all of your functionality, right? If you're in the middle of a JavaScript thread or a method call, and they close the browser, it's gone. You're done, and next time it launches up, you can try and recover that state from whatever's happening on the back end. And then the last capability that I'm going to talk about is push notifications. So I'm going to go through some of the concepts now that break this idea of a service worker down. So a service worker is an extension of a web worker. So a web worker have actually been around for about, I think, 4 years now. So this is really the core idea of a separate thread in JavaScript. So if anyone here has written JavaScript before, it feels very asynchronous. It feels like it's got multi-threading, but it actually all runs in one thread. So you've got these async calls, and you've got all the kind of callback hell, as they call it, but that's actually still running in one thread because it has to manage and control access to the DOM. It has to manage and control access to the user. What web workers give you is an isolated thread. And then what happens is you've given up access to the DOM, you've given up that level of control in order to get access to kind of the limitless resources of the CPU. And then you can block in your web worker and it doesn't block your main thread. So there was an example that was posted on HTML5 Rocks about 4 years ago when web workers came out, where it's a Google map. And they're overlaying on top of a Google map a navigation path with like 100 hops. And if you're going to do that without a web worker, it's going to block the UI, right? So every time you calculate a new path, you can't update the thread unless you leave that process. But with web workers, you can do both simultaneously. It's very exciting. Web workers are super easy to create. You say new worker, and you pass it a JavaScript file, and then you can pass a message to it, which actually kicks it off. Web workers have fantastic support. Yeah?
What's the difference between a web worker and an AJAX call?
A web worker is a local secondary thread. So an AJAX call is actually operating in the same thread even though it's non-blocking. So an AJAX call requires you to go out to the internet and then come back. So you can't process 2 AJAX requests simultaneously, or you can't block them. There's a couple other limitations there. Web workers are almost universally supported. Yeah?
How many web workers can you have running simultaneously?
I'm sure there's a limit, but I've never hit it.
Fair enough. That's good enough.
Don't do 1,000. I mean, I would say kind of do your standard multitasking best practices, right? So if you're building an Android app, you're not going to have 100 threads, I hope. So probably do the same thing on web. So web workers have fantastic support. So I'm going to show you a much different picture for service workers, because as I said, service workers are a little bit forward-looking. This does not look good. But the good news is that it is actually an HTML5 standard, which Firefox has implemented in their latest versions. Chrome exists on both mobile and web today. And then Microsoft has actually agreed to support service workers via the standard, which is kind of cool how forward Microsoft is trying to be. We'll see if they ever succeed, but they're saying, they're communicating as if they're trying. But the nice thing about service workers is that they don't have to be all or nothing. A service worker can be used to augment your existing site. So anyone who has a laptop in front of you, you can actually go to this URL, chrome://serviceworker-internals. And what you'll probably notice is a bunch of service workers are already installed on your computer. So websites that you've been going to, without your knowledge, without your consent, have been installing programs on your system. But because it's based on a standard, based on a set of interfaces that we know aren't going to compromise your computer, it's okay. Did anyone go to this URL and pull up a different site that's using service workers? So okay, we've got Medium, Pinterest, Duolingo, Google obviously, Slack.
Actually, I have opera.com.
Opera.com is using service workers.
I just have a question. Is this what Firebase uses?
So Firebase is not using service workers. Firebase is using WebSockets.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's the TCP/IP HTML5 standard for communicating over the web. So I'm going to go back to the beginning and kind of explain what a service worker is again. So a service worker is a thread of your web application written in JavaScript that lives on the user's computer and runs separately. So it goes through a process of, at first the user has no service worker installed, and then they visit a website such as Pinterest.com. That service worker is going to install in the background just via a JavaScript call that they make, and then that service worker is going to become active and then idle over time. And so what will happen is that service worker will remain installed in the system even when they're not loading the web page. So we talked about fetch and message here. That's two of the capabilities of service workers. Couple gotchas with the technique. So you have to use HTTPS to use service workers. The reason behind that is if they allowed HTTP, I could silently intercept your traffic, install an application on your computer, and you never see that web page again. You only see mine, which would be a terrible state of security. So this whole system assumes HTTPS has not been compromised by the NSA, et cetera. And then placement of your service worker JavaScript file determines what scope you're able to access. And then there's a weird thing that I'm going to walk through a couple times, which is that a service worker takes control of the page, as it's called, this after you refresh, right? So when you load Pinterest.com, it's going to install a service worker in the background, but that service worker is not going to be intercepting your web traffic until you refresh. So I wanted to walk through a short little timeline. Hopefully this is not too confusing. So I load a standard web page index.html, and what it's going to do is it's going to run the JavaScript on the page. It's going to asynchronously load all of the scripts I've got, all the CSS, etc. And then one of those JavaScript calls is going to install the service worker. So that's going to get installed, and then it's going to be active but not controlling. If I then update the service worker and refresh the page, that service worker that I installed is actually able to intercept all of the HTTP requests I made. So what this means is, when your page, the second time it tries to load your style.css file, you can actually intercept that and load it from a cache or load something else. And the power behind this is that if your user went offline, your service worker is the one getting called, not the web. So it's a way of really building applications via the web. And then the weird thing about service workers being installed or taking control after you refresh can kind of be seen here. So let's say you make a change to your service worker. That, once again, does not get loaded until the second refresh. So some of that will become clear over time. So there's 4 main events that you get when you build a service worker. So you get an install event. So what JavaScript should I be running when I install it? So that's typically where you're going to want to cache any files that you want. So you can say, hey, I'm going to be using AngularJS. Let me go download that and save that locally. I'm going to go use this data. I'm going to go set up all those data stores. Then activate, so when your service worker becomes active. Third, fetch. So this is the method that's called every time the user tries to load a URL. So instead of going directly out to the internet, you are intercepting those calls, and you can decide, do I want to try to serve this locally, or do I want to just let that go out to the internet? And then the last one is push notifications. So this is when you use those web apps that have push enabled. This is the method that's called that allows you to actually show that to the user. I'm going to keep this relatively short. I do not expect everyone to be building service worker applications after this. Hopefully, I've got a couple links at the end that will help you if you're interested in more. Service workers are registered just like a normal worker. You just call navigator.serviceworker.register and you pass it the JavaScript file that you want to run and the scope it has access to. Then this is an example install method. So I'm creating a cache of all these files. And so what this is actually doing is this overcomes any sort of security problems where you can actually turn off cross-site scripting safety within your control, and you can cache kind of local files as you would think about them in an app. And then on the fetch command, so whenever a user's computer tries to go out to access the internet, you can actually intercept those and you can respond with a different file. So this is where I'm actually going to get those files from my cache. And then there's a great, in one of the examples I'm going to give you guys later, there's a tool called logging.js, which I highly recommend, which will show you absolutely everything that goes on with your service worker. I'm running a little short on time here. So, do you guys want to hear about push notifications? I said, how many here do web development? Okay, so I'll just run through this really quick. So, push notifications on Android are awesome, right? Whenever the user is, whenever your server wants to, it can call it to a push notification. Wake up your Android app, refresh a cache or whatever you want to do. Same thing on the web. It actually uses the URL that you hit when you want to send a push notification to Chrome is the https://googleapis.com/gcm. So it's actually the same API, almost identical. What they've done is they formatted it for web, created JavaScript codes and commands that you can call in Chrome, and then it's forward-looking. So as soon as the HTML5 standard is available in Firefox and Microsoft Edge, etc., this will be there as well. So it's the same thing that you're going to do on iOS or Android. So you're going to subscribe the user to push notifications in the main thread, right? So a user action says, I want push notifications, which matches the kind of Android marshmallow paradigm of having to ask a user for permission to do anything. Then you're going to get the user's registration ID saying, hey, I need this ID to send those push notifications. Then you need to implement the push event and respond via your service worker. And then lastly, send a push notification. So here's an example curl command that if you just put in your app key that you get from the Google Cloud Platform and the registration ID, that'll send a push notification. So the last piece here is just two URLs. The first one is a super simple service worker tutorial. If you just download this from Jake Archibald, who works for Google, you will actually have your first service worker. And then the second URL is a different type of service worker. So the first service worker implements caching, so it intercepts all of your HTTP calls so that it works offline, so that you can actually redirect the things that your app's doing. And the second one is a push notification implementation. So these both use the same underlying technology, just different methods on it, and they're taking care of different use cases. And I'll post this to the meetup as well. All right, questions? Yeah.
With the push notifications, let's say you want to ask the user a yes or no question, or have them confirm or click on something to open up a page. Is all of that supported as well?
Yes, yeah. The user can do, so the best practice that you're supposed to follow is you're supposed to display some sort of toggle somewhere in your UX that you completely control about whether or not the user should be receiving push notifications. And then when they click that button, they're going to get a Chrome pop-up. Do you want to allow this application to do push notifications?
I mean, in the push notification itself. So with Android, you can get a push notification that says,
So I would say it's like primitive Android push notifications. So you get an icon, you get text, and you get a tag.
So you don't get any of the control pieces. You can't put buttons inside the push notification and then receive those events from those buttons inside.
Not yet. And so actually one of the weird things about Chrome push notifications today is you can't actually send a payload yet. So that might sound weird, and it is. You definitely should be able to send a payload. Like so with Android, you send down the payload, hey, this is what I want to let the user know about. On Chrome, you just say, hey, there's a push notification, and then it's up to the application, which is then woken up and then allowed to do AJAX requests or whatever it wants to go figure out what the push notification should say. So looking back at the Slack communication example, in Slack when you enable push notifications, Google sends the Slack a message, hey, this user on this computer wants a notification, or has a notification, and then the application wakes up, calls Slack, and says, what should I be showing the user?
So that's like the chat room on Stack Overflow.
Do they have push notifications?
Yeah,
Oh,
they have alerts when you're on the different pages, so.
okay. Yeah, I mean, there's several hundred apps out there, like big name apps that are starting to use these standards. And once again, I mean, you don't have to use these if your user doesn't have the latest version of Chrome or whatever, or if they're using Safari. Your service worker is basically going to be ignored. The user's not going to have any offline capabilities. They're not going to be able to receive push notifications. But for those users that do, it's a added enrichment to the experience. The last thing that I didn't really touch on in terms of what service workers can do is now web pages on Android in the latest versions of Chrome can actually pop up and prompt the user to install the web page to their home screen. So they have some weird rules that I think they just kind of made up on the spot and they're trying them out to see if they work. So if you visit the application in 2 prior days, then you're allowed to pop up and install a prompt. So if I go to Pinterest.com on my phone twice, but not in the same day, like if I went yesterday and 2 days ago, then I can pop up this install, which actually is pretty cool because you can control how that application renders from the home screen. So you can get rid of the URL bar, you can get rid of you can control the UX, you can walk into portrait or landscape, and that user just gets that prompt, which is actually in some ways better than native mobile because often when you're on Facebook.com or LinkedIn.com, and it's going to give you that whole annoying prompt that you had to build and you had to control. This is kind of more of a native, non-intrusive experience to say, hey, you use this website a lot, add it to your home screen. Any other questions? Perfect. Oh, yeah.
Do you know if we plan to add service workers to like native Chrome apps?
So this is actually part of the interesting thing. I mean, Google's perspective. Do you guys know what native Chrome apps are? I've talked about it like twice, I think.
One takes download, then installs, get rid of it.
Yeah, so it's a fancy Chrome extension that runs more like an app. So it's JavaScript, HTML, CSS that runs like an app on your computer via Chrome as the runtime. And they have a bunch of APIs for accessing storage, etc. So I was talking to the Google team, and they talked about, hey, should we add a Chromecast API to Chrome apps? And the Chrome team was kind of like, well, why don't they just build a web app? So it really does seem like Google is saying, hey, the future is web applications with this sort of rich functionality, such as what you can accomplish, such as offline push notifications via service workers. So you can use service workers in Chrome apps, but I don't know why you need to, because you already control offline, you already control caching, you already control notifications.
Right, but you can't spin another thread.
Oh, you can. I mean, you can do that by workers.
Right.
So, yeah.
But if you want to use the service worker.
You could do that. Yes.
Well, I mean, if you try to create a service worker and come back out, those you can, I'm pretty sure it doesn't have.
Does it? I
Okay.
haven't tried that. But you can definitely do workers. I thought. You'll have to correct me later. All right, food's here, guys. We'll take a little break and eat, and then move on to the second section. Thanks.
So if you get a push notification in Slack,
So
saying
later when
someone
we
send
do
you a
the workshop, it'll be
message,
mobile.
Yep.
So
tap on that
we
notification,
make the
and
different
then
stations,
open
so you
up
want to bring
web
the
app
stuff that you got.
and end the conversation and allow you to respond back to that message. Like, is it?
So yeah, so the JavaScript app controls what you render a push notification.
When you tap on push notification, it then opens the app.
Yes, it's not already.
Okay, so when you're just